here to preach on humility does feel a little like asking a lion to give a lecture on vegetarianism. That's because, in part, in our common frame of humility, it often means something akin to lowliness, a meekness not associated, perhaps, with the pulpit. As a dear colleague that you might know of mine says, Reverend Jason Shelton, you've got to have some ego to preach. Or as my colleague Reverend Nancy Allison puts it, look, sometimes you've got a dog of a sermon, and you've got to be able to walk that dog proud. Many of you probably know the children's song, and you can sing along with me if you know it. Nobody likes me, everybody hates me. I think I'll just go eat worms. Yes, worms. This has generally been the interpretation of humility by many a Unitarian Universalists. And in a world where religion, political figures, and even traditional roles of teacher or preacher have not as much power over people as they once did, and that is all for the better, we seem at times in our faith to have a rebellious relationship with humility. I'm too good and worthy, we say, quoting our first principle, to fall prey to some religious humility. Now, it is true, for those who've experienced oppression in its many forms, we are all too often taught to be humble in a way that means to submit, to go eat worms. But is this really the humility that the prophet Micah speaks of? From the origin of the word, we are taken back to a Proto-Indian European word that means earth. Humility shares the same root word as the word human. To be grounded, to be an earthling, a being of the earth. In one of my previous congregations that I worked in, I got to know a young man who was just 2 years into his sobriety. And over the course of my time there, we would go out regularly and meet for coffee or lunch and talk about how he was doing. And invariably, in those first few encounters, he would talk to me about a struggle that he was having, something that he was trying to be consistent on and maintain. And I would switch into this mode of being a spiritual cheerleader. You absolutely can accomplish all of this, and you can do it. You are incredibly gifted. And again, I would do this spiritual cheerleading. And finally, after about 4 times in this encounter, he stopped me in the middle of my lavish praise with my pom-poms in full pose. And he said, "You have got to stop doing that. Thinking that I could control everything, believing that I could be perfect, is the biggest thing that trips me up back into my addiction." Every day, he said, I begin with the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And so he said, when you come in telling me that I can be perfect and that I can do it all, it's the opposite, Robin, of what I need. I need to be able to learn to be supremely human. I've never forgotten Nick's lesson to me in avoiding spiritual cheerleading. And I think about it lately, because I think we have a crisis of humility in this country. And I'm not thinking of any one or two people. Though I knew that's where we would go. But I think collectively, we've lost center and balance of ourselves. Consider for a moment the almost existential crisis of meaning and purpose that so many are struggling with in the dimensions of identity as the demographic landscape and the power landscape in this country is shifting. Consider the crisis of humility that occurs in social media. I can't tell you the number of times I find myself in the Facebook death spiral, as I call it, looking at some perfect photo of a friend of mine with her family and their color-coordinated outfits against an autumnal landscape that doesn't have a leaf out of place. And I look round my living room, and it's 11 o'clock in the morning, and neither of my children are dressed, and only one of them has pants on. And I start the comparisons. Or I hear about the new success of one of my colleagues on Facebook giving a TED Talk, looking brilliant, and I look down at my pile of email that I seem unable to conquer that day, and I feel wholly insufficient. Maybe you too sometimes find yourself in the Facebook death spiral, as I call it. It's of course because when we do that, we're comparing our insides to everybody else's outsides, right? The second text we heard today, Micah 6:8, is the essence of my mission in life. It's been my guiding star. What does the Lord require of you but to love mercy, to act justly, to walk humbly with your God? And over the years, I've discovered the layers in this passage. For example, when we look at the Hebrew words, your God, we learn that this text is humble enough to assume that there are other gods. It's an instruction, not saying the God, the only God, but the range of answers. It just meant, in this text, the God of the Israelites. When we look at the word humbly, we consider the origins of that word to be of the earth. It's related to Adam, from the Hebrew word red earth or clay. So does that mean to be a worm and shrivel in the sun? Most certainly not. It means to be the fullness of a human being, to be able to conceptualize future worlds, to know in all of your imaginings the beauty of what we could be and the limitation of our scope to create such worlds. To be human is to be able to conceive of utopia and invariably to live in the flawed world. To be human means you are neither your worst mistake nor your best PR. To live in between of go eat worms and I am in control of everything. And ultimately, to be human is to be in a process of becoming that we all know ends with death. And so it is this mortality that develops our humility. Because we are not who we were yesterday, and we will be someone else tomorrow if we are granted the grace of that day. Christian Picciolini is a former white nationalist leader. He has created, as far as I know, the only group in the country that reaches out to youth and young adults who have been swept up in white nationalist groups and neo-Nazi groups and tries to help them get out. And when Christian tells his own story, he talks about being a young youth and kind of aimless, without any sense of self, actually being pretty depressed. And he tells the story that one day he was in an alleyway and he was engaging in some behavior with a substance that we would not want to support, talking around the story. And this man came up to him and said, "Hey, quit doing that. That's what the communists want you to do, so you're lazy and you don't see what's happening, how you're getting trampled on as a white man." And Christian said, at the time, he didn't even know what a communist was. And he wasn't too clear what trampled on meant. But this man had a sense of self that Christian hadn't been given in his life, and it was deeply appealing. And so over time, this man became a protector to him, even though he called him to be violent in order to receive that protection, to harass people. Eventually, Christian started a band that was one of the preeminent neo-Nazi bands in the country, and they would go around singing all sorts of white nationalist songs. And Christian said he remembered one day when they were on a tour with the band, and they had gone out that night, and they went into a McDonald's, and there were some young African-American men there, and somebody in the group said, "Hey, you need to get out. This is our McDonald's." And so the youth started to leave, seeing trouble on the horizon, and Christian and his bandmates chased them out of the McDonald's. They got into a fight, and Christian started beating this young youth. And he said that there was this moment when he looked into the youth's eyes and he could see his humanity. And he could see how this person saw him. And he saw just in his eyes someone who could be his brother, his friend, his father. He stopped. And that was the day that Christian began to walk away from white nationalism. He tells now in communities as he goes around to do this work of rescuing youth, how a false sense of humility as a youth, a go eat worms identity, a thinking he was completely unworthy, made him vulnerable to the tactics of white nationalism. He says the solution to this is to give often these young men and women the ability to see their own humanity in balance. I've been thinking about these two instances that occurred in a middle school here in Summit, and recently, just 2 days ago, in the high school. I've been holding the knowledge that these swastikas were likely painted or written on a wall by a child. By a child. And I wonder how we're going to move as a community beyond our traditional modes of us versus them, about our ways of trying to excise hate. And instead, think about how we're going to gift this child a better way to be human. One of the patients that I worked with when I was a chaplain was named Mary Kate. This was when I was in New Mexico, and Mary Kate was from Texas. And she came into the oncology unit in the hospital that I was working in New Mexico. And she was the only person that I'd ever seen come in matching pajamas and slippers. I walked into the room, and her hair was perfect, her outfit was perfectly matched. She had a stack of cards that she was pre-writing to thank people for their care. She was the only person I'd ever heard mention perfection as a goal in treatment of cancer. She was going to beat cancer perfectly. Spoiler alert, that's not an easy or possible thing to do. And so she kept trying to hold it all together for everyone, not letting anyone take care of her, not being vulnerable in any way, smiling every time anyone came in her room, reassuring them that she was just fine, that she was in control of everything. Until one day, the chemo caused her brain to have a complete imbalance, and she was out of her mind. She ended up naked in her bathroom, mumbling to herself. And because I worked with Mary Kate quite a bit, the nurses on the unit, not wanting to restrain her, said, "Could you come in and can we try to talk her down and get her back into her bed and her clothing?" And as I walked into the room, her husband and I started talking to her, and we were able to get a robe around her, and he helped guide her back to her bed. I remember a few days later going to see Mary Kate in her room, and she had her senses about her and could remember what had happened. And I watched how this woman who had prized perfection and being in control, for the first time, allowed her husband to take care of her, allowed herself to be human. And I realized in all that time of trying to be in control and trying to be perfect and take care of everyone else, trying to preserve, I think, her dignity, Mary Kate had lost her humanity. And it had taken being completely and absolutely vulnerable to find it again. I think the lesson here is that it's not only okay to say I don't know how to do this, but it is a faithful act to admit our limitations, to accept our failings, and to live into the tension of the world we can imagine and the one invariably we create that falls short. The truth, the God, if you will, is somewhere in between all we've ever longed for and exactly who we are. Soul or wretch? I heard a little more wretch this morning, I have to say. Perhaps we are both. That is the truth of our soul work. In the words of Mary Oliver, who gives us the message of universalism in poetry, you do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about your despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clear blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. May we each find our place here in the family of things, a place of peace, of courage, of justice, of mercy, of love. And may that journey be kissed with the presence of grace, something greater than ourselves. Call it God, the universal, the ancestors, call it community. Something greater than ourselves that holds us still.